Hello and welcome back to another episode of 8-Bit Monsters Monster Deconstruction for D&D 5th edition. On today's episode, we're going to look at the Junior Drow Priestess of Lolth, another pretty popular shorts episode on my YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen the YouTube shorts, go check it out. You can find it under my name of Andrew Philhart. Where can you find the Junior Drow Priestess of Lolth? It's in the book Waterdeep, Dungeon of the Mad Mage, on page 149. Now this drow is supposed to be a CR2, and as we go through this episode, well, we might find out that this is either a little less or a little more depending on how we use it. Now let's look at encounter building. If you wanted to use the drow as an epic encounter for your players, you could do so with 5 or 6 players at first level, or 4 players at second level. This is due to how low the CR is for our drow here. After that, how could we use this drow as a group monster with other allies for the drow to rely on? Well, we could start using one of these monsters against 6 players at second level, which defeats the purpose of it being a group unless you have more than 6 players. Then you could pit one of these drow against 4 players at third level, which is more likely the case. Or you could then move into one drow against 2 players at 4th level. After that, we would look at how to use this drow as a solo monster against one of your players, and you can do that at 5th to 7th level. And then after that, this drow starts to become a swarm monster. Against one player, you could end up putting 2 of these drow at 8th, 10th level, 3 of the drows at 12th level, or 4 of these drow at 13th to 14th level and on. Once you hit this level, it's probably better off to turn it into the classic minion monster with maybe 1 hit point. But then again, you want these casting spells, so maybe not. Who knows, it's up to you. Anyways, let's take a look at some of the skills and traits that our Junior Drow Priestess of Lolth has. So our drow has some skills, and these are medicine, perception, persuasion, and religion. Now, in battle, you're not going to get any use out of these except for maybe perception, or possibly even medicine. Actually, you could even use persuasion. More than likely, religion's never going to be used. But these would be best used in town settings or other areas out of combat to get the most out of these skills. After that, there's really nothing else in this skills section for our drow, so let's take a look at the traits that it has. The first trait is Divine Eminence, and this is similar to the Paladin Smite. And when the drow decides to use this during melee combat, it can use a spell slot of first level and higher, adding in 10.5 DPR on a level 1 spell, and adding in an additional 3.5 DPR for every other spell slot above the first. This is good in terms of usage, but this should only be used in a last case or crit circumstance since the drow is so very weak in its defenses, as we'll see in a little bit here. Now, because our drow is an elf, they have Fey ancestry, and this gives advantage to being charmed and can't be put to sleep, but this has no effect on calculating the CR value, so we're going to skip it because it has no effect. Now, innate spellcasting. Its first one is Dancing Light. This has no effect on combat, so we're skipping it. Darkness. This could add a small effective AC bonus, but since Dark Vision doesn't help here, there's no immediate effect to the drow whatsoever, and we can kind of skip this as well, giving it no effect. The next would be Fairy Fire. Now this could give an effective +4 attack bonus, but you would suffer no damage on that round of combat since it takes an action to cast, giving this no immediate effect. This could be extremely helpful if the drow is with a group of other drow or other allies, but it does diminish the overall CR value for this drow if it uses one of the first few rounds of combat to cast Fairy Fire. It's all very situational, so you would want to use your best judgment as to when to use Fairy Fire because you only get 1 use of this per day. Next, the drow has Spellcasting. Now, these next spells have no effect whatsoever on combat, and we're going to skip over those, and that's Light, Thaumaturgy, Lesser Restoration, and Dispel Magic. There's no effect, we're skipping those. Sacred Flame, on the other hand, will add 9 DPR to each round of combat, but this is probably going to be used as a last ditch effort once the drow runs out of spell slots. Next is Cure Wounds. This could add plus 7.5 effective hit points, and then an additional 3.5 effective hit points after that. But because it also takes an action to cast, there's no immediate effect on the CR value. Next is Guiding Bolt, and this is used in the OCR calculation. Its base damage is going to be 14 DPR and will increase for every spell slot above its base level. You can take a look at the spell to see how this will affect it, or you can take a look at the damage tracker that I have for helping me understand what the damage output for this drow and all of my casters are. Next is Spiritual Weapon, and this is a must-use and must-have for all clerics in the game, or any cleric-based monsters, because it uses the bonus action, and many casters have a hard time filling in the bonus action spot for their action economy. This is a perfect weapon to use every round right from the first round, no matter if they're casting utility spells, or they're in melee, or they're casting ranged damage spells. Always throw out Spiritual Weapon if you have access to it. At its base, this will be adding plus 7.5 DPR every time, so this is great to have, provided it hits. And then lastly is Spirit Guardians. This is going to be using the concentration of our drow here, and is also another must-use item since it's the only damaging spell that it can concentrate on. So this will probably be like round 1 damage here. And this could add plus 27 DPR, provided that it's targeting at least 2 creatures per round. The last trait that the drow has is Sunlight Sensitivity. Now, since it's understood that drow should be used underground, this trait will have no effect on the CR value. Otherwise, it could give a -4 attack bonus while in the presence of sunlight. So if the players are smart and maybe pull out, torches or other extremely bright sources of light while facing drow, we could see a -4 bonus, provided that this sunlight sensitivity is in effect every round. But because it's not considered to be used, there's no immediate effect on the CR value, oddly enough. Again, when D&D is calculating these monsters' CR value, it's in the monster's best case scenario. So in this instance, sunlight sensitivity would have no effect because it would not be in the monster's best case scenario. Now that we have all of these out of the way, let's take a look at the DCR. Pretty straightforward. There's nothing modifying the drow's DCR whatsoever. And this is unfortunate because the drow has an effective hit points of 27. And if you look at the chart in the DMG in the custom monsters section, this is only going to rate our drow with a DCR of 1/8. That's dismal hit points, especially if you're in melee combat and trying to use Divine Eminence. This is why I recommend not using Divine Eminence, or not even trying to use it, only in a last case scenario should you be using Divine Eminence and putting this drow in melee combat. So beyond that, there's also nothing affecting the effective AC. Actually, let's take a step back. The effective hit points could be modified by Cure Wounds, but it takes an action to cast Cure Wounds. That would be taking away from the damage that the drow could be using. Therefore, we don't consider Cure Wounds into calculating the CR, because it's all about how much damage can this monster put out and also receive while surviving as long as possible. Okay, let's take a look at the effective AC, which is 13 from its armor. This is the expected rate for a DCR 1/8. It's 13. So because of this, we're not shifting the DCR 1/8 at all. That's it. It's a DCR 1/8. Pretty dismal, unfortunately. So let's take a look at the OCR then. Our DCR is so low. We should also expect an extremely high OCR value. And that is the case here. If we use Spiritual Weapon and Spirit Guardians on the first round, we're going to get plus 7 DPR from the Spiritual Weapon, an additional plus 27 DPR, provided Spirit Guardians is hitting 2 targets. After that, I would use the last 3rd level spell slot for Guiding Bolts, dealing an additional plus 21 DPR. And then on round 3, I would be using a second level spell slot, adding in an extra plus 17 DPR. On rounds 2 and 3, we should still be getting an additional plus 27 DPR from Spirit Guardians, provided at least 2 creatures are failing their saves, and the spiritual weapon is also hitting. This will end up resulting in a high amount of average DPR, and the average DPR would be 47 damage from those first 3 rounds, provided we use those higher level spells. And when we apply the 47 damage to our chart in the offensive section, we'll see that this is ranked at an OCR of 7. That's really high for a printed 2. This is a very typical case of high OCR ratings and low, dismally low defensive ratings. Not all the monsters I have deconstructed look this way, but there's a lot that do end up with this kind of off-scaled balance. It's insane. Since the majority of our damage is coming from the Spirit Guardians in this case, I'm applying the effective DC rating. And the Drow has an effective DC of 13 from its spellcasting abilities. Now, an OCR 7 is expecting a 15. The 13 is -2 under the expected. This results in a -1 shift. So the OCR 7 drops down to a 6, which is good because a 7 is very high damage for a printed 2. Now, that means that, in theory, our players should be saving against this more often than they're not, but who knows? I mean, it's random die rolls. This could change every turn by every player depending on how they throw the dice, or if they're using RNGs. Who knows? Alright, we have the OCR set and the DCR set. Let's calculate those numbers and see what we come up with. Now, our DCR is a 1/8. And we add that to our OCR of a 6, which equals 6.125. We average those out, and we get a 3.06125. We round that down, and this becomes a CR3. What do you know? It's a printed 2, but if we use the damage rotation that I have, and it works out in the Drow's favor, this is a CR3. So what do we do to try and drop this CR3 down to a 2 and get the printed value? Well, the easiest thing I found was don't use Spirit Guardians. I know this is annoying, and you probably don't want to do that, but the added damage with having at least 2 players fail their checks every round really cranks up the damage. So instead of using Spirit Guardians, switch Guiding Bolt to using a lot more higher level spell slots. This will also help the allies hit as well, so there's a bit of a trade-off here. But the average DPR will drop from 47 to 27 if we use 2 third level spell slots for Guiding Bolt and 1 second level spell slot as well for the first 3 rounds of combat, on top of having the spiritual weapon out. So we have an average of 27 damage, and we will look at the chart in the DMG. This is an OCR 4. Right away, this is great. And because we're looking at spell attacks and not like AoE spells, we're going to switch from the difficulty check to an attack bonus. And our Drow has an attack bonus of +5. When we look at the OCR 4, this is expected, which is great, so that means there's no shift to the OCR 4. And when we go through the motions and add in the DCR of 1/8, we'll get a 1/8 plus a 4, which equals 4.125. Averaged out, we get 2.06125, and rounding this down, we get a 2. Perfect. Here's our CR2. We don't use Spirit Guardians. Now, this is, again, the best case scenario, and we're expecting the Guiding Bolts to hit every time. If the Guiding Bolts don't hit, or there's higher than average damage, or lower than average damage, this kind of goes all over the place, and this is why we use average damage all the time. It's because it's too chaotic, there's too many numbers, we just use the average. So if you want to get the CR2 all the time, unfortunately don't use Spirit Guardians. That's my opinion and my recommendation. The last section, battle tactics. How would I use this Junior Drow Priestess of Lolth in battle? Well, first of all, definitely wouldn't use it as an epic encounter. more than likely this Drow won't survive an epic encounter with 1st or 2nd level players if it's by itself. This Drow needs allies. It especially needs melee allies, someone that's going to be in the front lines protecting this Drow while it does all the magical casting it can do. So consider using this a mid-range caster and always using Spiritual Weapon no matter how you use it with these suggestions here. The first thing you could consider doing is using this as a utility support caster. You might want to use spells like Fairy Fire or Sanctuary. Fairy Fire will be great to help give the allies advantage on all the attacks against the players, while Sanctuary is great for your most important allies, probably the ones dealing the most damage, either be it, a mage in the back lines or the tank in the front lines. Sanctuary is going to be really, really handy for these instances. You may also want to consider using Lesser Restoration or Dispel Magic for any status effects that may be on your allies to help greatly improve survivability. This also really depends on party composition and if they're using debuffs or focusing mainly on damage. If they're focusing mainly on damage, then using the Drow as a utility support caster probably is going to be highly ineffective. If we do use this Drow as a utility support caster, then the CR value tanks all the way down to a 1/2 because all the damage that it's got is coming from the Spiritual Weapon. And then on top of that, with its already low DCR value, this is what we got. But the Drow is focusing on keeping the other allies alive. So this is primarily up to you. You could use it as pure utility support, but you're kind of doing a disservice to this Drow at that point. Now, if you don't use utility support, or there's no need for it, then this Drow should probably be used as a ranged DPR, casting its guiding bolts, using its spiritual weapon, and possibly even using the Spirit Guardians, as seen above in the OCR section. Again, Spirit Guardians is great, provided the Drow is getting at least 2 players at any time. If the players start to spread out in a way that targets only 1 player at any given time, then you may want to consider switching to another concentration spell, maybe Fairy Fire or something else that it has. But be careful because Spirit Guardians will greatly increase the CR value for this Drow, as we saw earlier on. Guiding Bolt is always great for the added advantage on the next attacks and a good use of the higher spell slots here, especially if Spirit Guardians isn't being used. You may want to consider saving 1 spell slot for Dispel Magic in case you have something really big affecting one of the Drow's allies. But other than that, D&D expects fast-paced combat, and using those 2 spell slots for Guiding Bolt and the advantage is probably the way to go. And then finally, the FCR here, if used in this way, will be either a 2 or 3, depending on how Spirit Guardians works out in your favor. And lastly, melee combat. Like I said before, this is a last resort. You really don't want to use this Drow in melee if you can help it, because it has so little hit points. And due to those lack of hit points, this Drow won't survive combat for long. Divine Eminence is great to use if this Drow is switched into melee, and then this can increase the damage output for this Drow, but casting spells at ranged is highly recommended. But if you are using melee for this Drow and are able to hit with its mace every turn, and you have the spell slots available, especially if you are using the 3rd level spell slots and 2nd level spell slots for Divine Eminence, then the CR will equal a 2. Which is surprising, but you have to use both the 3rd level spell slots and one of the 2nd level spell slots in combination with the spiritual weapon hitting as well. But the question is, how long will this Drow be able to live with only 27 average hit points? If you're going to use this Drow in melee, you may want to just take the maximum hit points provided by the hit dice. So ultimately, I would use this Drow as a mid-range spellcaster, focusing on damage spells and only considering support spells as needed. Thank you for joining me this week as we took a deeper look into the Junior Drow Priestess of Lolth from D&D 5th edition.